وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد خاتم أنبيائه ورسله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we're continuing to look at the fiqh related to traveling. So we saw that we began looking that one becomes a traveler if one leaves the city limits, and one's considered to have left the city limits from the direction one's leaving from, even if that is within the diameter of the city limits on one or more sides, right? And that happens, right? Cities are not always shaped in a consistent manner. So then he tells us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, that ويشترط أن يكون جاوز أيضا ما اتصل به أي بمقامه من فنائه. That it's also a condition that one have gone past what is connected to the city, يعني أي بمقامه من فنائه, of its outer, of its adjacent built up area, right? كما يشترط مجاوزة ربضه, right? As one needs to have gone past the, what's the rabad? What's the rabad? He defines it, right? وهو ما حول المدينة من بيوت ومساكن, of the outlying houses, because usually cities would be walled, right? Because cities, economically, cities are stores of wealth, right? So someone has wealth, they would protect it, right? So they'd wall the city. But cities grow because there's money there, there's jobs there, so people come there. So cities outgrow their walls, right? But sometimes you'd also have people that you wouldn't want within the city. So those people living out, the outlying areas, right? So the rabad are the outlying areas, which is outside either the walled city or the main part of the city, right? وهو ما حول المدينة من بيوت ومساكن, right? فإنه في حكم مصر, because that takes the ruling of the city. كذا وكذا القرى المتصلة بربض المصر. And likewise the cities that are connected with the outlying areas of the city, يشترط مجاوزتها في الصحيح. One needs to go past them according to sound opinion. So that's the idea in our times of the legally stronger opinion would appear to be that you don't just look at the small political unit, like it's almost like a philosophical, what is Toronto? Is it the city of Toronto itself, or metropolitan Toronto, or is it the greater Toronto area? Right? Because metropolitan Toronto is made up of a certain number, the original 5 cities of Toronto, right? Toronto, North York, East York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, 5 constitute. Yeah. But then are you talking about just the city of Toronto or metropolitan Toronto? Also the greater Toronto area. So the adjacent suburbs are considered, even though they may be legally separate, but they're considered from the city, right? That would be the closest to what they mention, and there's khilaf on this, right? Right? But he says, fi sahih, the same thing would be the qura, would be other, it's qarya, or even two cities are connected, it's considered one area, right? و وإن انفصل الفناء بمزرعة أو فضاء قدر غلوة وتقدم أنها من 300 خطوة إلى 400 لا يشترط مجاوزته. But if the outlying areas are separated by a farm, right, or empty area, the extent of a ghalwa, of a shouting distance, right, which is 300 to 400 steps, it is not required to exceed this. أي الفناء. But this is مبني على العرف, right? Right? لأنه this is لا يعتبر من المصر, because this would not be considered to be part of the city. We just considered a city. Many cities in Canada have a green belt around them, right? So there is a park, and then the inhabitations continue. Are you considered to have left the city because of the park? No, right? So in that sense, when there are clear political delineations, like if you're driving on the highway, when are you considered to have left Mississauga? When you've left the legal limit of Mississauga, right? And when you've gone on to Oakville, when you've entered Oakville, right? Very often between, like if we look at the Greater Toronto Area, very often there's geographic separators, right? The various rivers that are cutting across and so on, right? What's the river that divides Etobicoke and Mississauga? Huh? Right, at least by the lake level. When you get down to the lake, what's the separator? Do you know? You must. Right? Whatever, like the Humber River between Etobicoke, you know. So there's what's considered within the city limits is part of the city limits, right? Right? وكذا لو اتصلت القرية بالفناء لا بالربض. What's the فناء? He's defined it already, right? The فناء is But what's the difference between the ربض and the فناء? Yeah, الفناء, as he defines, is المكان المعد لمصالح البلد. Right, is the area designated for the interests of the city. So that would include the stables, for example, the garbage dump, other things that. Whereas the rabad is the outlying living areas, right? Right. Sometimes you have, anyways. Outsiders living over there, right? Sometimes tent areas would develop in those places, etc., right? Depending on. So كذا لو اتصلت القرية بالفناء لا بالربض لا يشترط مجاوزتها بل مجاوزة الفناء كذا في قاضي خان, right? And if a town becomes connected with the fina, with the outlying area which is prepared for it's not inhabited, but it's where they would have the things related to the interests of the town. Some places that they have the warehouse areas and the manufacturing areas on a corner of the city. One doesn't have to go past those, but one just needs to go past the fina. This is what's mentioned in Qadi Khan. وَيُخَالِفُهُ مَا فِي النِّهَايَةِ. This is contradicted by what's in the Nihaya, one of the great commentaries on the Hidayah by As-Sighnaqi. وَالْفَتَاوَى الْوَالْوَالِجِيَّةِ, and the Fatawa al-Walwaliji, وَالتَّجْنِيس وَالْمَزِيد of Al-Marghinani, ونصها, and the in the تجنيس of Imam al-Marghinani, ويقصر بخروجه عن عمران المصر, that one shortens when one leaves the built up area of the city. ولا يلحق ولا يلحق فناء المصر بالمصر, and the outlying uninhabited area, the fina of the city, is not considered part of the city, right? So Rabad is inhabited, right? It's like it's outlying dwellings. The fina is an uninhabited outlying area that's there for the masalih of the city, storehouses, stables, with respect to safar. And it goes back, where is the city considered to end, right? ويلحق الفناء بالمصر لصحة صلاة الجمعة, and the fina would be considered part of the city because you could pray Jumu'ah from there, right? Right? And right, that you could pray Jumu'ah in the fina, in the outlying areas. Because sometimes, like, you have the city where people live, and there'd be people working in the fina, right? Now, if you built a masjid there, no one actually lives there, so it'd be considered part of the city, even though people aren't living there, because it's connected to the city. Because if you imagine you have a city, walled city, but they have, for example, the city decides that, we don't want the smelly professions in the city. We're known for metal works, but they have the metal works by the river outside the city. Now you have all these people over there. You built a masjid there. Can you do Jumu'ah there? So the fina you could do. So he says, وَالْفَرْقُ أَنَّ الْجُمْعَةِ مِنْ مَصَالِحِ الْمِصْرِ, that the difference is that establishing the Friday prayer is from the interests of the city. وَفِنَاءُ الْمِصْرِ مُلْحَقٌ بِالْمِصْرِ فِيمَا هُوَ مِنْ حَوَائِجِ الْمِصْرِ, and the outlying uninhabited areas of the city are considered of the city in that which relates to the interests of the city. وَدَاءُ الْجُمْعَةِ مِنْهَا, and establishing Jumu'ah there is from it, because there could be a lot of people working there, right? وَقَصْرُ الصَّلَاةِ لَيْسَ مِنْ حَوَائِجِ أَهْلِ الْمِصْرِ, as for shortening the prayer, it's not from the needs of the people of the city. فَلَا يُلْحَقُ فِنَاءُ الْمِصْرِ بِالْمِصْرِ فِي حَقِّ هَذَا الْحُكُمِ, so therefore the outlying areas of the city would not be considered part of the city with respect to shortening the prayer. When have you left the city? When you've left the city, right? The city itself. So it's outlying areas. Have you left the city? Yes. But could you still do Jumu'ah there? Because one is because it's not far from the city, right? It's adjacent to the city, so you could do Jumu'ah there, right? And so how does that apply now? So you have two things, right? You have the fina and the rabad, right? The fina, what's from the masalih of the city, and the rabad is the outlying inhabited areas. So the outlying inhabited areas, are you considered to have left the city limit? What does he say? Right? So you do well to diagram it, because he mentions two opinions. He mentions the opinion of Qadi Khan, and he mentions the opinion of the Nihaya. Right? 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 The fina, the outlying areas, the rabad is considered part of the city, correct? Right? right? The fina, you don't have to go past the fina, right? So the fina, the outside area, and if you look at it in a simple way, right? It's a bit like if you visit someone's house. If you sat outside their house, but within their property, would you say I visited Jacob's house? Yeah, because you went there, you met him. But if you went just to the fina, the outer area of his house, but you didn't actually enter the house, like you didn't ring on the door, are you considered to have visited him? You didn't see him yet, right? Because it's outside the house in one sense, and it's part of the house in another, right? So what relates to the interests of the city, the fina, this outside, like the service area, right? It's outside the city, but during the day there'll be people there because there's stables, there's possibly factories, some outer markets, whatever, there. So given that there'll be people there and it's connected with the city, you could do Salatul Jumu'ah there. But is it considered part of the city with respect to travel? Like, can you start shortening once you leave city limits? Yes. Right? City limits, even if you haven't gone past the fina. This is the other opinion. Right? 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 This is the opinion of the Tajnis and Mazid, that though you can establish Jumu'ah in the fina, if you've left the city limits and you haven't gone past the fina, you can. What can you do? You can start shortening. When can you start shortening? If you intended a masafat safar. So you've now gotten outside the city limits themselves, but the outlying area you've not gone past. There's two opinions here. What does he prefer in the matan? You have to pass it. So, and he based that upon whom? Qadi Khan. Right? But then he mentions the second opinion. Right? Right? So this is of the areas where, what is he preferring in the commentary? Huh? Second opinion. Right? 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 Because of the significant difference right? Regarding this, right? So here, how do we can do a micro exercise, which is what do we find in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya about this, right? And we can take that, right, in terms of the textual position. However, practically in our times, cities have very clearly defined limits. So where you can yarhamukumullah, right? And that which is considered to be, so the contiguous suburbs are considered to be part of the same urban area, right? Especially given the size of the cities, right? Figuring out, okay, is that house part of the city or not? Simple. Where are the city limits, right? And practically, you can even check, right? We had a situation at a camp before class, before Jumu'ah. Imam Zayd was walking up to give Jumu'ah, and I was sitting next to Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, and he goes, is Jumu'ah valid in any madhab over here? Should we just be doing Zohar? Because Malikis are very strict on where Jumu'ah is held. Said because the said in the Shafi'i school, you need 40 resident people. Well, who are the resident Muslims here? Nobody. Said if it's not right, we shouldn't do it. Can't do. It's like I checked the night before, right? On Google Maps. So although it looked like it was outside city limits, because it was a camping ground, but within the city limits, and they tell you these are the city limits, and there's inhabitations outside, but they have demarcated city limits. So if it's within city limits, it's part of the town. Right, so once you've left what is defined as being the city limits, you're gone. Contiguous suburbs are considered to be part of the city. If two towns are, there's many places, like for example, if two cities are connected, right, then, and that gets tricky. If they are connected without a gap in them, then then they will be considered one urban area. So you're not a traveler within that urban area. Right. Okay. والفناء المكان المعد لمصالح البلد كركض الدواب ودفن الموتى. And the فناء, the outlying area, is a place prepared for the interests of the town, such as the grazing of the cattle and burying the dead. وإلقاء التراب, and where they put soil, because when you build, you have to dig up soil to build a house. So where does that soil go? Keep it outside, because then you might use it for other things, right? ولا تعتبر البساتين من عمران المدينة. And the gardens, basatin is gardens or orchards, right? The fruit orchards. They're not considered from the dwellings of the town, right? People don't live there. وإن كانت متصلة ببنائها, even if they're connected to the buildings, right? ولو سكنها أهل البلدة في جميع السنة أو بعضها, even if some people live there for some or all of the year. ولا يعتبر سكن الحفظة والأكرة اتفاقا. And the dwellings of guards and hired hands. And what are the akara? Yeah, it's helping hands, right? Well, they're helping in the garden or other, hire. Kira is someone, it's like someone you hire to do specific work, as opposed to like ajir, like it. And we can use interchangeably, that kind of. It's like the hired help. So they come like they may come seasonally, whatever. But you don't want strangers to be living in your midst, right? Because the security concerns. So that they lived outside. That's not considered part of the city itself, right? A lot of that goes back to urf. What is the city is we considered city. Some of this describes the urf, right? So where the urf changes, right? Right now with, like there are differing considerations in some of these things. So ويشترط لصحة نية السفر ثلاثة أشياء. Three things are required for sound intention of traveling. الاستقلال بالحكم, that you are independently able to make the decision. والبلوغ والثالث عدم نقصان مدة السفر عن 3 أيام. Right? That you're able to make the independent judgment, that you're an adult, and that the traveling distance is, the duration of the travel is not less than 3 days. فلا يقصر من لم يجاوز عمران مقامه. So whoever hasn't gone past. So now al-istiqlal bil-hukm, this will be explained because it's for common sense reasons, right? Let's say that the manager and his assistant are, they're both, a sales manager and their assistant are traveling around Quebec for work. Now, who's making the decision? How long do we stop in different places? The manager, right? But he's going day by day. So business is going really well in Quebec City. Like, they're making a lot of sales. So if the assistant says, we're staying here 15 days. But the manager says, no, we're only staying here for 5. Is the assistant's intention credible that I've become resident now in Quebec City? No. Because if the manager decides, okay, tomorrow we're moving on, it's his intention that counts. Because what is the intention? Right? The intention is the resolve connected with the action. So if your resolve is not connected to the resultant action, that resolve is not really of consequence. Right? Now, in some cases, this may not necessarily apply. Right? And we had a funny life situation. We decided to go on a road trip of the US as a family, because we have family in different parts. So we didn't have any money. We went in a station wagon. It was 5-seater, but there was 9 people in it. One of the desi kind of travel things. 7 or 9 people. But anyways, 2 people would be sitting in the station wagon's trunk. No seat belts, anything, across all of the US. We had a weak sense of law back then. We didn't become so Canadian yet. Just a few years into being in Canada. But we stopped in one city, and we went to visit family, and because visiting family is free, right? The other family that was with us till Southern California, they went there to see all these things. Now my dad was, we didn't have much money, so they wanted to go to Disney World and this, and we wanted to visit family. And then we'll do whatever we can, but generally we're choosing things that are affordable. So I wanted to go here, there. Wouldn't say it, but it's also practical. And we are aware, budget's kind of tight. So now, it's conceivable that the intentions could be separable. How? My dad said, no, we're staying here for another few days. They said, no, but we need to go on to San Diego, to etc. I said, no, we're staying here for this. This is the itinerary that we set. So, they separated. So, the sign of someone being tabi', following another, is عند الخلاف. If they separate, who would follow whom? Right? Because if it's clear, right? If it's clear, then that's when it's عدم الاستقلال. Right? But the reason I mention this, it happens sometimes, right? Let's say husband and wife go on a road tour of Europe. Wife loves, for some strange reason, Roman civilization, because they read some book as a kid or something. When they reach Rome, she intends to stay there for 15 days. Husband says, we're only staying there for 4. Now, what we're going to read, what is it predicated on? That one person will follow the other عند الاختلاف. The wife decides, I don't care what my husband says, I'm staying here for 15 days. It's not whether they're the wife or the employee or the child or whoever, right? So let's say, if Omar and I went to Istanbul. Now if he says, okay, I'm going to go where my father goes, and I decide we're staying in Istanbul for all 18 days, if he's going to follow where I'm going, then he's resident. But if he says, I don't care whether what happens within the first 2 weeks, I am going to Konya, then he has istiqlal bil hukum, even though it may look like, well, I'm following my dad, but he says no. Within the first 10 days, if my father doesn't go to Konya, I'm going to Konya. Okay. Right? So this is predicated on the assumption that one person will listen to the other. And this is not always the case, as reality tells us in our times. So just be aware of that. Okay. So given these three conditions, right, that one makes independent judgment, is adult, and the duration of travel is 3 days, فلا يقصر من لم يجاوز عمران مقامه أو جاوز العمران ناويا لكن كان صبيا أو تابعا لم ينوي متبوعه السفر. So prayer is not shortened by one who doesn't go beyond the inhabited area of their city, or goes past the inhabited area with intention, but they're a child or a follower, and the one they're following does not intend travel. Right? But of course, intend travel, what does it mean? It's not to say, I intend travel, meaning that they're maqsood, qasd. النية is qasd, ويظهر في المقصود. Right? Intention is resolve, and it's found in what you're resolving to. Right? So someone says, oh, I went to Kingston, but I didn't intend to travel. Is that an acceptable statement? No. Because intention is, where are you going? It is not to, the Hanafis don't understand intention as to being a ritual act. That the intention is, I intend X. It's the answer to the question, أين تذهب? Where are you going? So I'm going to Kingston, but I didn't intend travel. No, you did intend. Because al-qasd bil-maqsood, right? The intent is by what is intended, right? فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُ? So this one of the scariest questions in the Quran. So where are you headed? نسأل الله العافية. Right? So people get very confused about, so be very, very clear. Right? If their follower did not intend, so if the one they're following, so the child, why? Because the child, the expectation they'll be following their parent, right? Or they would have a guardian, right? Typically, normally, a 9-year-old, can a 9-year-old fly by air without a guardian? Yeah, if you have to make the arrangement, the airline appoints someone to take care of them, right? But if a child, let's say a 10-year-old child, are they baligh? Let's say they're not. So what do we do? A 9-year-old child, 10-year-old child, do they have to pray? Does a 10-year-old child have to pray? They have to pray. يؤمر به وجوبا. Right? Right? So let's say a 10-year-old child is flying from Toronto to Istanbul. Are they a traveler or not? They're getting on a flight. Of course. Right? Of course. But because the destination that they're going to is masafat al-safar. Right? So don't fall into the error here. Right? Because some people imagine, no, and don't teach it wrong, that, oh, if you're baligh, you can't intend travel. If you're not baligh, you can't intend travel. What does it mean? Right? It means that normally a child wouldn't travel on their own for a traveling distance. Right? Because they either go with a parent or a guardian. Right? Or that which takes the place of a guardian, of a safe group and so on. So it's the intention of those they're going with. So if you get on a flight, you get on a train headed to Montreal. Yeah? So via rail, you say, we have a child traveling to that, so they have an attendant, whatever the arrangements are. On the flight, how does the child pray? Who cares about are they a traveler or not? Yes. They're flying to Istanbul, they're a traveler. Because the maqsood, right? They couldn't make that intention. Imagine, child goes to Pearson Airport, says, I want to fly to Istanbul. Can they go on their own, just like that? Because they don't have istiqlal bil hukum. Typically, a child can't intend to travel, normally. Unless there's someone who is getting them there, adatan. Now, if there's faradul mas'ala, a child became Muslim in, let's say, and this is real things like this, in a Bosnian Muslim child was in a part of Serbia where there's genocide taking place. All their family's been killed. So now they head out to get to Sarajevo. So they're going a traveling distance. 10-year-old kid took a scooter. Are they a traveler? They're going 150 kilometers. Are they? Yes. No, but let's say they're sure. Right? They're sure. So that's where there's khilaf within the madhab, number one. Right? There is khilaf within the madhab about this, but the relied upon position is that when there is that qasd, right? That this is mabni ala al-ghalib. In the general case, these three conditions apply. But when the follower is independent, right? The follower is independent. So they both go. So let's say Zubaydah has gone with Zubair to a Sharia compliant vacation, right? But Zubaydah says, I'm staying here for 2 weeks. Zubair says, I'm not. I'm traveling. The istiqlal is tested that if Zubair leaves day 10 to go visit historical sites, Zubaydah will remain at the Sharia compliant resort because she wants to be in the Halal Beach Resort, HBR. Then she's independent. The child, the same thing. That if it is the case that the child is in fact The dhann al-ghalib is that they're going to get to their destination on their own. But that would have to be an exceptional circumstance. Normally that's only believed once they've traveled that distance. Because in the general case, a child can't get that far on their own. They'd be impeded. Someone would run into them, etc. But it's pretty straightforward insofar as a 10-year-old child, they're not mukallaf anyways. But if it happened, but if they're going on by any mode of transportation, a public mode of transportation, the fact that they get on the bus or the train or the plane, khalas, they're a traveler. So I didn't intend. It's not a ritual act. Number 2, al-qasd bil-maqsood, right? Right? And they mention that very explicitly, right? So, okay. ولكن يعني والتابع كالمرأة مع زوجها, and a follower would be like the case of a woman with her husband, on assumption of her listening to him. وقد أوفاها معجل مهرها, if he's paid the mahar due up front, because if he's not given the mahar that is due up front, she doesn't have to obey him in anything. Right? وإن لم يوفها لم تكن تبعا له, and if he hasn't paid the mahar due up front, she doesn't have to listen to him in anything. ولو دخل بها, even if the marriage has been consummated, لأنها يجوز لها منعه من الوطء, because it is permitted for her to prevent him from physical relations, right? والإخراج للمهر عند أبي حنيفة رضي الله تعالى عنه. What do you have, Omar? Right? والإخراج للمهر لها منعه من الوطء والإخراج من sorry, because I have a punctuation mark that's in the wrong place, right? لها منعه, she can refuse intercourse, ولها منعه من الإخراج, she can prevent him from taking her out from the city. She can refuse to travel. Right? Where would this be? You know, they got married at, they went to Kingston to get married. Traveling distance. He intends to travel on to Toronto. There's a mahar due up front, payable immediately. So they spent a few days at Thousand Islands, but he says, oh, it'll take me 2 weeks to pay the mahar. He said, I'm staying here till you pay the mahar. It'll be within her rights. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, and that's the fatwa position. والعبد غير المكاتب فيشمل الولد والمدبر مع مولاه, and the slave other than the mukatab, because the mukatab has some degree of independence, and this includes the walad, right? The female abd who gave, the amma who gave child to her master's child. The child is free; she'll be free upon the death of the father. And the mudabbar with their master. وَالْجُنْدِي مَعَ أَمِيرِهِ, and likewise the soldier with their commander. إِذَا كَانَ يَرْتَزِقُ مِنْهُ, if the commander or the leader is providing for them, right? right? Meaning, because you would have armies where the army would be supporting, but you also have voluntary armies, right? So someone went and they're spending time at one of the ribats, right? تطوعا لله تعالى, right? They brought their own provision, whatever. So they launched jihad. They said, we're going to spend 3 months fighting in the desert. After 5 days, Hamza Khan Zada was like, man, the desert's hot. And I really wanted to go there mainly for the talab al-ilm. Right? So he inquired, said, is this fard? He says, no, this is nafil. Do you really need me? He said, well, you're not really trained. You're okay. So they're intending to be at this outlying area for 15 days. You decide to leave. They're not providing for you, so you have no contract with them. You could leave. والأجير مع المستأجر, right? Or an employee with their employer, right? Like the salesman case that we mentioned. والتلميذ مع أستاذه, and the student with their teacher, on assumption that they'll follow, right? والأسير, and the prisoner. The prisoner says, we're going to be resident here for 2 weeks. But, because they're shifting them from one prison to the other, but the bus broke down. Of course his intention doesn't count, right? والمكره نسأل الله العافية مع من أكرهه, and the coerced with the one who coerced them. Because how do they make their own intention? نسأل الله العافية. على من أكرهه على السفر, the one who coerced them to travel. والأعمى مع المتبرع بقوله, and the blind person with the one who voluntarily agreed to guide them, because they're dependent on them. As for if they paid to guide them, then the blind person has a say. وإن كان أجيرا فالعبرة لنية الأعمى. But if the blind person hired someone to guide them, then the intention of the blind person is considered. وكان ناويا دون ثلاثة, أو كان ناويا, or they made intention for less than 3 days, right, of travel. And we took what that. لأن ما دونها لا يصير به مسافرا شرعا, because less than 3 days was not legally considered to be a traveler. Right? Less than 3 days worth of travel. And we took that definition, right? Which in our times, they said, it's just simplified, it's counted by the distance. وتعتبر نية الإقامة والسفر من الأصل كالزوج والمولى والأمير دون التبع. And the intention of residence is considered by the leader, the asl, the one who's making the decision, the husband or the master or the leader, not the follower, on assumption of listening, right? كالمرأة والعبد والجندي, like the woman, the abd or the soldier. إن علم التبع نية المتبوع في الأصح. If the follower knows the intention of the one they're following, according to the more correct opinion. This, or if it's known, right? If they know the intention, right? صريحا أو دلالة, right? 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 So we're going to Montreal. Means we're traveling. It's understood. And you, right? Says, okay, we're staying here for 2 weeks. We're staying here for 3 weeks. Now, you would assume that if you're staying here for 3 weeks, mean you're staying there for 3 weeks. It'd be superior to inquire that are you initiating any other journey? Right? Right? And that would depend on the hal, but the assumption is that you can act with the zahir. فلا يلزم الإتمام بنية الأصل الإقامة حتى يعلم. So one does not, the follower does not need to pray in full until they know the intention of their leader, that they're going to be resident. But they don't have to say, I intend to be resident. They say, I'm going to stay here for a month. Maybe. Right? They say the ثبت المتضمن ثبت المتضمن. Is that which encloses something is affirmed, what is enclosed is affirmed. Right? Staying here a month contains within it being resident. Now if somebody doesn't really travel, right, they're stationary, then you assume that where it needs bayan, a morally conscious person would ask. Yes, the issues of bayan istifsar, of bayan tafsir, right, etc. كما في توجه الخطاب الشرعي, just as the address of the Sharia applying to someone, يلزم بالعلم, right? It is required by knowledge, right? And other such things. وعزل الوكيل, and there's other such examples in the Sharia. The agent continues to assume agency until removed. But if someone says, so if Sidi Hamza requested from Sidi Anas to buy 10 copies of Shaykh Khalid Kharsa's commentary on Risalat al-Mustarshidin. And then he tells Zayn over here, I'm telling him not to buy it anymore. But then he went and bought it. Your intention, when you decided that you're removing him as your wakil to buy those 10 copies, is that binding upon him? No. He's still acting on your behalf as the wakil until your decision to remove him as a wakil reaches him. Otherwise there'd be darar on him. Right? That's the azl al-wakil. حتى لو صلى مخالفا له قبل علمه صحت في الأصح. Such that if one prayed contrary to the intention of the asl before knowing, the prayer would be valid according to the more correct opinion. Right? وينبغي الاستفسار. Right? بقدر الإمكان. Right? And one should ask. والقصر عزيمة عندنا. قصر is a ruling of resolve in our madhab. لما قدمناه فإذا أتم الرباعية والحال أنه قعد القعود الأول قدر التشهد صحت صلاته. So therefore, if one prays the 2 rak'ahs as 4, right? This is, and they had sat in the first sitting to the extent of the tashahhud, their prayer is valid. لوجود الفرض في محله, because the fard, which is completed with what? With the first sitting. The first sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. And everything beyond that was lahu. But if you didn't sit there, then you admix a nafil with the fard and it corrupts it, right? But people sit for the first tashahhud, so, right? Typically, right? وهو الجلوس على الركعتين, which is sitting after 2 rak'ahs. وتأصيل الأخريان نافلة له, and the 2 extra rak'ahs will be nafila, will be nafil مع الكراهة, with karaha of tahrim, لتأخير الواجب, because of delaying the wajib, right? And there's other things. And ترك واجب القصر. And because the qasr itself is wajib. Because that's the mashru'. Right? And a number of other things. Right? وهو السلام عن محله, and leaving the wajib, which is delaying the salam from its place. And there's other wajibs, as Tahtawi notes, right, when we pointed to. Right? إن كان عامدا, if this is done deliberately. وإن كان ساهيا يسجد للسهو, but if done forgetfully, one performs forgetfulness prostrations. وإلا أي وإن لم يكن قد جلس قدر التشهد على رأس الركعتين الأوليين فلا تصح. But if one hadn't sat for the extent of the tashahhud after two rak'ahs, after the two first rak'ahs, it is not valid. Right? فلا تصح صلاته لتركه فرض الجلوس في محله, because one left the obligation of sitting in its place. Number one, واختلاط النفل بالفرض قبل كماله, and mixing a fard and the nafil before the fard was complete. وهو مخالف للمشروع, and that is contrary to what is legislated. Right? It's a هيئة غير مشروع. It's a form that is not legislated. فلا تصح صلاته. Right? إلا إذا نوى الإقامة لما قام للثالثة, unless one intended إقامة. Right? Yeah, of course, نية صحيحة. Right? So you're staying at the hotel. I said, I intended, you're getting up, I intend to be resident. What is the intention? We asked, so what are you doing tomorrow morning after breakfast? Oh, I'm going to Montreal. Did that intention of iqama in Kingston have any weight? No, because the intention isn't the statement, I intend. It is توجه القلب نحو المقصود. It is the directing of the heart towards the object of the determination, the maqsood. Right? So the niyyah is not words uttered, nor is it a resolve that will be unfulfilled. النية, that's what I said, النية هو القصد المقترن بالعمل. It's the resolve connected with the action. Nobody, you wouldn't admit it to yourself. I'm resident, but maybe I'll travel tomorrow. If we repeated 10 tomorrows, are you traveling all 10 days? Yes. That's just fix what you did. Right? That's why it's also good to be أكثر أهل الجنة البلة. That most of the people of Jannah are simpletons, as the Prophet ﷺ said. And that's fascinating hadith. Because al-bula, it means like a simpleton, but also don't try to be too smart for your own advantage. Right? I'll intend. No, you made a mistake. If you're getting up forgetfully, all you have to do is what? Well, you could just sit back down if you're not standing yet, or if you stood up already, well, you can still sit back down, right? Because this qiyam is fi mahall al-rafd, right? So unless you've prostrated for the third rak'ah, you just sit back down, simple, and do forgetfulness prostrations because you added things to it. That's it. في محل تصح الإقامة فيه, in a place where the إقامة would be valid. If إذا كانت نية حقيقية, right? If it's a لأنه صار مقيما بالنية فانقلب فرضه أربعة, because with one's intention one became resident with that intention, with النية الصحيحة. So the obligatory act their obligation became 4 rak'ahs. وَتَرْكَ وَاجِبِ الْقُعُودِ, but one left the wajib of the sitting, الأول, وَتَرْكُ وَاجِبِ الْقُعُودِ الْأَوَّلِ لَا يُفْسِدْ, and leaving the wajib action of the first sitting doesn't invalidate your prayer. This is where you got up without having sat to the extent of the tashahhud for a 3rd rak'ah. Right? If one did intend iqamah, it wouldn't invalidate the prayer if it was valid, right? وكذا لو قرأ في ركعة لأنه أمكنه تدارك فرض القراءة في الأخريين بنية الإقامة. Likewise, the same thing would apply if one had only recited in 1 rak'ah, right? Because now you could rectify the obligatory recitation in one of the last 2 rak'ahs if you validly intended residence. Okay. So what are the consequences of iqama, of safar? ولا يزال المسافر الذي استحكم سفره بمضي 3 أيام مسافرا يقصر حتى يدخل مصره يعني وطنه الأصلي أو ينوي الإقامة نصف شهر ببلد أو قرية قدره ابن عباس وابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما. Right? So the traveler continues once they have realized their travel, right, by having traveled the distance of 3 days, the traveling distance of 3 days. They continue to shorten until they return to their city, to their permanent residence, right, to their city, meaning their permanent residence, or they intend to reside half a month in a town or village. This taqdeer was done by Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. Right? What reference do you have to that? What copy are you using? What does he say? Shaykh who? Shaykh Shannar has a copy edition. About Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar? What copy do you have? Okay. What copy do you have? Oh, you're using the old edition. Okay. Good. That's like pure Hanafi. We don't need references. Okay, that's okay. Okay. So, right? Now, of course, in our madhab, the governing principle is what? Al-maqadir la tunsab illa min qibal al-shari'. Limits are only established by the lawgiver, number 1. Number 2, we give more weight to the aqwal of the ijtihad, the qawl al-sahabi than the Shafi'is do. Because we understand the opinions of the Sahaba especially the fuqaha of the Sahaba, to be mubayyina lis-sunnah, right? To be explaining the sunnah. خاصة فيما لا يدرك بالرأي, especially things that are not established by judgment. Amongst the things that are not established by judgment are maqadir, right? Limits. Now, here, just pay attention to this, right? And even sometimes people reading the Hidayah and stuff, I'm very skeptical of most people reading the Hidayah because, like, the Hidayah, it's the battleground in the Hidayah is largely with the Shafi'is. There's the internal reasoning between the Imam and the Sahibin. Most of that is discussed legally because of shared usul. But then when you go the khilaf of the Shafi'i, normally they bring a hadith. But what's the challenge? That often those hadiths aren't so strong, but why? Because you can't really show a Shafi'i person that, well, this is based on what Ibn Abbas said. or Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar. Why? Because for them, for Imam al-Shafi'i, is, look, أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول. Where does Sahaba come into that, right? So it's not that they don't take the qawl of the Sahaba, but the role of the qawl of the Sahabi, according to Shafi'i, is much narrower. And that's discussed in Usul al-Fiqh, how and why. But, so what's the common ground? The common ground is some hadith. Inevitably, they'll have some issues with the hadith, because had they deemed it sound by their standards, they would have acted upon it, right? Which is also very intriguingly why a lot of the weak hadiths that a lot of the hadiths that the Hanafis use, right, are referenced in Sunan al-Daraqutni, which is almost written as a combat manual for Shafi'is against Hanafis. It's very intriguing, right? Because of intriguing critique of Imam al-Daraqutni. Imam al-Daraqutni is the one who criticized Sahih al-Bukhari for 120 something hadiths, or whatever the number is, I forget exactly, but over 120 hadiths. Because his critique was that this is not at your standard, O Imam Bukhari. He's not saying that they're wrong, they're false hadiths or whatever. He said, you set a very high criteria for Sahih, this is not at your criteria. Okay, so the scope of the critique has to be understood, and that's discussed elsewhere. But then people said, look, you know, it's an unfair criticism. Say, you criticize Bukhari, look at your own sunan. Like, it's DOA, da'if on arrival, problematic. Because much of the corpus of the hadiths of Sunan Daraqutni, especially the weak hadiths, are Hanafi hadiths. Because the Hanafis use those as argument. He brings out, and Imam al-Daraqutni is a master of ilal, of the hidden defects in the hadith. Right? Some of them have clear problems, others have hidden defects. So they're problematic. It's really cool. Right? Now, that's where, as a self-respecting Hanafi, you need to be aware that if you quote a hadith from Sunan Daraqutni to any discerning Shafi'i, they'll be like, you know, that's why one of the modern hadith scholars, well, hadith experts, scholars in the sense that he ascribed to scholarship and he did a lot of service to the deen. In an initial work of his on the subject of hadith, he said the Hanafis are further away from the Quran and Sunnah than the Torah and the Injil are. Later editions he removed that statement. But as a hadith scholar, you could see it. Like, why are you quoting Sunan al-Daraqutni? The reason being that we don't hold that to be the chain of transmission. That's a separate argument, but Sunan Daraqutni is a battleground for a lot of these kinds of things. Important to be aware of the science of hadith. That's why no excuse from skimping on hadith. Bismillah. So, and here, this mention, my copy also has a thoroughly unuseful footnote. It says it's mentioned by Zayla'i Nasb al-Raya. What did he say about it? God knows. May Allah forgive. Okay. وإذا لم يستحكم سفره بأن أراد الرجوع لوطنه قبل مضي 3 أيام يتم بمجرد الرجوع. Now, if one has not realized the travel, meaning that one has not yet, completed the journey, which is 72 miles. So, let's say if we're going to Buffalo to buy books, right? Once we leave city limits, we're travelers. But why? Because we are intending a traveling journey. But if we haven't yet passed traveling distance, if we decide to return, استحكم السفر, they haven't realized the journey, meaning you haven't traveled the traveling distance. Then you decide to return, you no longer intending a traveling distance. Right? So you got to Hamilton and you went to this wonderful kebab house, and you're like, it was much more expensive than you imagined. So we don't have money for books anymore. So you said, let's go back home. You're not a traveler. So there, if one hadn't traveled a traveling distance and one's returning, يتم بمجرد الرجوع, one starts praying in full as soon as one turns back. وَلَمْ يَصِلْ لِوَطَنِهِ, even if one did not reach one's residence. So intended a place that's 100 kilometers away. Once you leave city limits, you start shortening. But 50 kilometers into the journey, you're like, nah, it's going to be too expensive to find a hotel and stay there for 4 days, whatever. So you decide to drive back. You're not a traveler. You're like someone, if someone intended, it's that now your effective intention was a place that was 50 kilometers away. Is that a traveling journey? No. Right? The maqsood of the travel, the effective maqsood shrank below traveling distance. So you're non-traveler. لنقصه السفر, لنقضه السفر, because one negated the intention, the travel. Right? So there is a maqsood asli, 100 original intent was a destination that's 100 kilometers away. After 50 kilometers, you decide to go back. So now your intention became as though you only intended till that point of return, which is 50 kilometers. That's not a traveling journey. So, I mean, you could circumvent that, say, okay, let's go to a place that's traveling distance and then drive back. Then you've edited your journey within traveling distance, but you might end up wasting fuel, right? If you're hiking, for example, right? You're hiking 100 kilometers. Once you leave city limits, you're a traveler. At 50 kilometers, you're like, man, the next 50 kilometers are really tough. So Sidi Hamza says, look, let's shift the intention to this other point that's at 80 kilometers. But it's sort of halfway back. Right? So you have point A, point B, which is the destination. You stop at C, which is 50 kilometers away. Say, you know what? Why don't we change the destination to that point over there? That's 30 kilometers away. So and then we will go back home. But if you just intend to just return in the same direction, your trip was 50 kilometers. But you could actually, because what counts is the journey, the route that you take. So you can intend a route if you're really keen to keep shortening, right? Right? For whatever reason. Right? You can think through a lot of possibilities in the Bab al-Safar. Okay. بخلاف السفر عفوا لأنه ترك, because this is a ترك. بخلاف السفر لا يوجد بمجرد النية, right? Because الترك, the عمل is found with the نية, but the leaving must be connected with an actual act. I'll give an example. حتى يسير, until one travels. So if you stop at 50 kilometers, you can still travel until you head back with your action. Right? لأنه نقد, so he explains, right? right? والتروك تحصل بمجرد النية. Okay, so okay. Okay, so we have قبل مضي ثلاثة يتم بمجرد الرجوع. What do you have, Omar? What? Okay, what do you have? أتم يتم, yes. لنقضه السفر. Okay, yeah, because بمجرد الرجوع, what does the manuscript say? Because the إضافة has a word missing, which is مجرد إرادة الرجوع. Right? Right? What? Okay, so the idafa here, you have to be careful about this, right? Right? That's why you pay attention to not get lost in too many examples. So Bismillah. So it says, وَإِلَّمْ يَسْتَحْكِمْ سَفَرَهُ, if one does not realize one's travel, بِأَنْ أَرَادَ الرُّجُوعَ, such that one intended to return now. An intention that will be connected to the action, it's a real intention. They decided, that's arada, they intended meaning they decided to return to their home before traveling the traveling distance, ثلاثة أيام. They would be, we pray completely بمجرد الرجوع. Here مجرد الرجوع means أي بمجرد نية الرجوع, right? وإن لم يصل إلى وطنه, even if one did not go back to their, it did not reach their hometown. Why? لنقضه السفر, because they negated their travel. How? بإرادة الرجوع, right? When you decided you're no longer a traveler, you're no longer a traveler, right? لأن إرادة يعني نقض السفر, right? Because the irada is a tark, right? إرادة النقض is a tark, right? Right? And there is of course something implicit. And the tark, right? يحصل بمجرد النية, but this is a little complicated because it depends on what it is, right? What it is. So this is Imam al-Tahtawi's explanation that tark يحصل بمجرد النية. It's a little more complicated. If you're fasting, you intended not to fast, does that count as a breaking of the fast? You're praying and you say, I'm not praying, but you're continuing. Does that break your prayer? No, right? So there's tafsil in that, right? So ahkam at-tark, right? The rulings of tark, right? But here, if you intended, you decided, right? The intention meaning the decisive intent. Decided to return. Upon decision of return, you're no longer a traveler, even if you haven't begun returning yet. Right? So where it says بمجرد الرجوع أي بمجرد نية الرجوع, with what's meant before. As opposed to safar. As opposed to safar, the intent of safar is not enough until you've taken the action. Right? بخلاف السفر يعني لا يوجد أي السفر بمجرد النية, because the travel is not found by intent alone. You're sitting at home saying, I've intended to travel. It doesn't happen حتى يسير. Until the one who made the intention to travel initiates the journey. بأن يخرج من العمران, such that they have left city limits. لأنه فعل. Because the initiating of an action, intention is not enough. ما لم يقترن بالعمل. I intend to pray. Go ahead, say Allahu Akbar. Right? Does the action begin? But the turuk, there's some the ahkam al-fi'l wa tark, there's some nuance. I don't want to unpack it here. We could share it on the forum. You could find it. Ahkam al-fi'l wa tark, you could find it in al-ashbah wa al-nadha'ir. Al-Hamwi explains it out. But there's a distinction between different types of actions. Because intuitively, travel, are you considered in the action? Right? There's a few dawabit, but we'll see them. They come up in fasting as well, particularly, right? Now, what's the difference between fasting, prayer, and travel, for example, right? In terms of the intention of leaving the act. Okay. وقصر إن نوى أقل منه أي من نصف شهر, and one shortens if one intends less than a month. أو لم ينوي, or one did not intend شيئا وبقي على ذلك سنين, and one remained on that for years. This is highly far-fetched. I don't know if I'm living in Toronto. Did you rent a place? For how long? For a month. خلاص. Did you book your return ticket? Yes. For a month from now. That خلاص. These are all, right? And القصد بالمقصود, right? And what is دلالة الظاهر? Right? لما ادعى خلاف الظاهر لا تقبل دعوة من ادعى خلاف الظاهر. The claim of one is, someone says, I don't know how long I'm going to be in Toronto. So you ask them, are you leaving this week? No. Are you leaving next week? No. Are you leaving this month? No. Do you have enough money to travel? No. Then what do you mean? Nothing. Okay. So this is far-fetched. So much so that some furu'a should not be explained to the awam. They get confused unnecessarily. So I don't know how long I'm living here. Who are you kidding? Right? وهو ينوي الخروج, right? Intending to travel. في غد أو بعد غد أو بعد جمعة, leaving in a day or so, or within a week. جمعة meaning a week. لأن علقمة بن قيس, because علقمة بن قيس, right? It's related from some of the early Muslims. مكث كذلك بخوارزم. He did this in Khawarizm. سنين يقصر الصلاة. For years, shortening prayer. Maybe he genuinely didn't know if he's traveling on. Okay? But that's far-fetched. That's far-fetched. That's why Imam al-Shurunbulali in the 11th Islamic century is citing someone from 700-800 years ago. Right? It's not a common phenomenon. It's theoretically possible, right? ولا تصح نية الإقامة ببلدتين لم يعين المبيت بأحدهما. Right? It is not valid to intend to reside in two places without specifying that you're staying in one. وكل واحدة منها أصل بنفسها. This is the watan iqama. Right, so what's the case? Let's say someone comes from the States to Toronto. Right? His maternal relatives are in Mississauga. His paternal relatives are in Hamilton. Said, I'm staying in both places. You make one the asl and khalas. Right? وإذا كانت تابعة, if they're adjacent, like a village, يجب على ساكنها الجمعة تصح الإقامة بدخوله أبنيتها. If it's an adjacent place, like a village that's connected to the city, such that its dwellers would be required to do Jumu'ah. So they're not distant. It's not a distant village. And we'll see the ahkam of that in Jumu'ah. كذا تصح إذا عين المبيت بواحدة من البلدتين. It's also valid to be resident if you intend to stay in one place. So how do you simplify this for people? So I'll be staying between the two places. So it's okay. Because Toronto and Hamilton are not traveling distance. So okay, make one the primary place and this other the secondary. That's it. And so you're muqim, you're staying between two adjacent places for more than 15 days. So then you're a traveler. Then you're a resident. Right? لأن الإقامة تضاف لمحل المبيت, because residence is ascribed to the place where you go to sleep. But you don't have to stay. You don't have to sleep all 15 days there. You intend, I'm residing here, and some days I'll be staying down the road. That's fine. Right? ولا تصح نية الإقامة في مفازة لغير أهل الأخبية. It is not valid to intend residence in the countryside for other than the countryside dwellers. Right? لعدم صلاحية المكان في حقه, because the place is not a place of residence for you. Right? But this is the countryside, meaning in a place where there isn't inhabitations. Right? Right? The reason this is important, because what if a place where there's inhabitations, like what? If you're staying in a campsite for a month, are you resident there? Let's say a campsite in a remote area. The campsite is salih lil iqama, right? Because is there one, do people stay there for, can they stay there for prolonged periods? Yeah, it's a campsite, right? Is there, do you have access to food, water, etc.? يعني ما يحتاجه للإقامة, yes. Let's say there's a hotel. I have some friends who get very stressed out by, they've been doing it during COVID too, right? They get very stressed out by having a lot of family around. They have high stress work. So they've been going and staying at a hotel. And to be safe, they're going to a hotel in the middle of nowhere. You're staying at a hotel in the countryside, right? Like the hotel I went to in Germany last year. Right? In the middle of the countryside, this big hotel. There's people have been living there for years. I'll tell you guys the story separately. Can you intend residence there? That's not the countryside. By the countryside meaning, like in the middle of the fields. Now, if you've decided to become a countryside dweller, a desert dweller, then okay. And the shart of that is that you have the provision, water, kala, things for your cattle to graze, etc. So you will be able to make that intention. Right? But someone living on a farm, can you intend residence on a farm? Of course you can. Because the farm is not the countryside. What's meant by the mafazatin is the open, uninhabited area. Mafazatin is like the desert, for example, right? In an uninhabited place, right? Right? Now, on a ship you're a traveler, even if you're a sailor. right? That's the relied upon position, right? And there's some tafsil. Al-Hasan, meaning Ibn Ziyad, said otherwise, but that's not a relied upon position. But it does exist, right? As-Sayyid quoted, Tahdawi quotes it from Sayyid, who quotes it from the Bahr. But you go back there to the Bahr to see what the discussion is. But that's not a relied upon position. But that narration does exist. If someone says, well, this is where I live, right? They spend 9 months on a ship. There are opinions to the contrary. But point being that a farm is not the mafaza. The mafaza refers to like an uninhabited area. Now, by definition, a hotel in the middle of nowhere, a campsite. Do people live there for an extended period? Yes. Can people live there for an extended period? Yes. There's food, there's provision, this is, You've got to be clear about that, right? So mafaza literally refers to the desert. It's called mafaza because it's the empty place. It's actually the word mafaza. Anyone look it up? Yeah, but why is it called mafaza? No, because it's one of the addad. It's one of the opposites. It actually refers to mahlaka, right? As a place of destruction. So the Arabs often call something by its opposite tafa'ulan, out of tafa'ul, because it's called mafaza, because originally it was mahlaka, because if you get lost there, you're going to die. But tafa'ulan, out of hoping for the good, they called it mafaza, the place of safety, meaning the place we hope to be safe when traversing. Right? Sometimes they use opposites, ishfaqan, right? Out of care, right? So, for example, one of the words for there's many words for a blind person, and many of the books of lugha mention these near synonyms, but each has a distinct sense. Like a'ma, what are other words for a'ma? There's a whole bunch. But one of the most famous is al-darir. But another of the words for the a'ma is al-basir. Now, basir literally means the one who can see. But basir is sometimes used as one of the addad, of the opposites. Why? Let's say someone respectable. You wouldn't say like wa fadilatu Shaykh Zubair a'ma, like this. I mean, you can, because it is factual, but you want to praise him, right? So that, and etiquette sometimes subtle. One of the ways they say wa basir. It'll be understood that by saying basir, what do you actually mean? Darir. And the Arabs use this for different, sometimes out of hope, sometimes out of shafaqa, sometimes out of respect, right? So anyway, so mafaza is like that. This does not apply to farms, does not apply to hotels, camping grounds. Because you could, now camping ground is not a town, but if you're staying in a campsite for 3 months, are you a traveler? But is it a town? No, so you have to disconnect two things. Ahkam of Jumu'ah and a place where you can be resident. Right? I have a friend, he negotiated, he decided, he went to a private university, so the residences were expensive. So he went down to the local local hotel. Said, "How much are your rooms?" He said, "This much." And he talked economics with them, and he said, "Look, you guys need." Said, "I can guarantee 100% occupancy to a double room for a whole year." They only had like 60% occupancy or whatever, right? said, how? And he negotiated a price that was better than the dorm room. He's staying in a hotel with a meal plan. Breakfast and buffet lunch for less than what he paid for the dorms with a meal plan. Stayed in a hotel. Now imagine if you stayed in a hotel outside the city. Say, I'm a traveler. In which world are you a traveler? Right? So class is over. We'll continue from there. Other places that you can't be resident. So this program, I didn't realize with the program, but it was at a yogic hotel in rural Germany. This yogic group had purchased a hotel in rural Germany for €1 on condition that they'd redevelop it, etc. We're off camera, right?